A mother and her children, lost in a blizzard. A scarred man who vowed never to open his door again. And a past that rides in with a gun and a grudge. What happens when survival turns into love, and love is forced to stand its ground? This isn't just a story of the Wild West. It's a fight for family, for redemption, and for a place to call home. You won't want to miss a second of it. The night wasn't just cold, it was a predator. The storm rolled across the jagged peaks of Glacier National Park with a hunger that devoured sound, light, and hope. Snow fell sideways, driven by winds that howled like wolves in the darkness. The air bit skin raw, and the moon vanished behind roiling clouds, leaving only a void that swallowed everything beneath its merciless shroud. Somewhere in that black expanse, a mother named Meredith Price staggered forward with 3 children clinging to her skirts, every step a war between exhaustion and the primal will to survive. They had been walking since dawn, leaving behind the remnants of a broken wagon and the place where the man they once called father had abandoned them. His words still clawed at Meredith's mind. Cold, sharp, final. Figure it out, Meredith. I'm done. The betrayal was more chilling than the storm, more deadly than the wolves they heard howling in the distance. And now, as night swallowed the last sliver of twilight, Meredith knew every decision she made would be the difference between life and death for the only family she had left. Ethan, her eldest at 11, led his younger sisters with grim determination, his small frame bent against the wind as though he could shoulder the storm itself. Beside him, Hannah, 8 years old and trembling with each gust, clutched his hand so hard her knuckles were white, and sweet Lily, barely 5, stumbled and whimpered, her eyes glazed with terror and cold. Meredith urged them on, her voice raw and thin as she whispered, "Just a little further, please." But there were no landmarks, no lights, only an endless sea of snow and darkness. Meredith's legs burned with every step. Her breath tore at her throat in ragged gasps. She knew if she fell, if she let the blackness swallow her, her children would die alone on this frozen hell. So she kept moving. She forced her legs to obey even when every nerve screamed. She prayed to any god who might listen in this forsaken wilderness, prayed for a miracle she no longer believed in. Then, as the world around them became a blur of white, and the line between dreams and nightmares thinned, Meredith saw it. A light, faint and flickering, barely visible through the shifting snow. It danced like a firefly in a tempest, a tiny defiance against the storm. For a heartbeat, she thought it was a cruel hallucination, but when she blinked, it was still there, warm, yellow, alive. Her heart surged painfully against her ribs. She almost fell to her knees in relief, but the children needed her. She squeezed Ethan's shoulder, lifted Lily into her arms, and they pressed on. Each step was agony. The snow reached their waists and the wind battered them until they could barely breathe. But that light pulled them like a lifeline through the blizzard's rage. When they finally reached the cabin, Meredith's knuckles were so numb she nearly couldn't knock. She forced her fist up, pounding once, twice, 3 times on the rough wooden door. Nothing. She knocked again, harder, panic rising like bile. Her voice cracked as she tried to call out, but only a hoarse rasp escaped. For a moment, she feared the light had been a trap of the storm, a false hope meant to lure them to their deaths. Then the door creaked open. A figure stood framed in warm lamplight, his face obscured by shadow, his silhouette broad and imposing. The man looked like he'd been carved from the same stone as the mountains, his shoulders thick beneath a worn coat, his hands hanging at his sides, calloused and capable. His eyes, when they met hers, were pale and sharp, glinting like steel even in the dim light. He took in the sight of Meredith, her hair wild with frost, her cheeks cut raw by the wind, and the 3 children huddled behind her. His gaze lingered a moment longer than comfort allowed, as though he were measuring something deep inside them all. Then, without a word, he stepped aside. Meredith hesitated only a second before half carrying Lily inside, the other 2 children stumbling after her. The door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the storm's howl so abruptly it felt like the world had gone silent. Warmth hit them like a blow, the crackle of a hearth filling the cabin with the smell of burning cedar. The children collapsed to their knees, gasping. Meredith stood swaying, lightheaded, eyes locked on the stranger. He moved quickly, with the economy of a man who had spent too many nights alone, with only survival for company. He pulled blankets from a cedar chest, wrapped each child with practiced hands, and stoked the fire until the flames leapt high and fierce. Only then did he look back at Meredith, his expression unreadable. "You from the East Trail?" he asked, his voice low, gravelly, carrying both suspicion and something else, a tiredness, a weariness born from years of solitude. Meredith's voice cracked as she tried to answer. "Our wagon broke," she rasped. "We've been walking days." He nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Name's Callum Ridge," he said after a beat. "This is my place. You're safe here, for tonight." Those last words, "for tonight," fell heavy, both a promise and a warning. Meredith's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor beside her children, clutching them close. Her eyes never left Callum's as the firelight danced across his face, revealing the scars that lined his cheek and the deep hollows beneath his eyes. For a long moment, neither spoke. The storm outside rattled the windows, shrieking like a beast denied its prey. But inside the cabin, the air was thick with more than warmth. It held questions unspoken, fears unnamed, and the first fragile threads of something neither of them dared believe in yet: hope. Because in that moment, on a night when the blizzard wanted them dead, Meredith realized they weren't alone anymore. And Callum, who had sworn never to open his door to another soul, found himself staring at a woman and 3 children who just might thaw the ice around his heart. He didn't know their story. He didn't need to. He only knew one thing for certain. Whatever force had brought them together in this storm was bigger than fate, bigger than fear. And it was only the beginning. A mother and her children, lost in a blizzard. A scarred man who vowed never to open his door again. And a past that rides in with a gun and a grudge. What happens when survival turns into love, and love is forced to stand its ground? This isn't just a story of the Wild West. It's a fight for family, for redemption, and for a place to call home. You won't want to miss a second of it. The sky was just beginning to bruise with the first hints of dawn when Callum heard the horses. He was outside splitting the last of the morning wood, the rhythmic swing of his axe in perfect sync with the quiet breath of the mountains. But the distant echo of hoofbeats shattered that peace, each thud reverberating in his chest like the ticking of a clock running out of time. His heart sank as he dropped the axe, eyes narrowing toward the tree line where shadows moved with unnatural confidence. Inside the cabin, Meredith was braiding Lily's hair while Ethan and Hannah giggled over a game of checkers. She paused mid-braid, senses prickling at the sudden tension that radiated from Callum's silhouette outside. She rose quickly, peering through the frosted window just in time to see the riders emerge. 3 of them. Dark figures on dark horses, their posture too controlled, too sure to be anything but dangerous. Callum stepped off the porch, boots crunching in the crusted snow, and planted himself in the clearing with the calm resolve of a man who had made peace with what might come. His eyes were steel, his shoulders squared, but his mind raced. He'd feared this day since the first moment Meredith and her children stumbled through his door. The past never stayed buried forever. The first rider dismounted with calculated ease, brushing snow from a long black coat that looked foreign against the rugged backdrop of the Montana peaks. His face was pale, sharp, as a blade, and his smile was the kind that never reached the eyes. Callum recognized him instantly. Victor Harlan, a man whose name once rattled even the bravest lawmen. Years ago, Callum had crossed him during a job gone sideways, a job that ended with blood in the snow and Callum's resolve to leave that life behind forever. Victor's eyes swept over the cabin, lingering on the thin wisp of smoke curling from the chimney. He turned his attention back to Callum with a predator's patience. Well, Victor drawled, his voice smooth and cold as river ice. Callum Ridge. Didn't think I'd find you playing house at the end of the world. Inside, Meredith felt every word like a blow. She gathered the children quickly, whispering for them to stay quiet as she eased them into the back room, her eyes never leaving the thin wooden door that now felt like paper between them and the storm outside. Callum didn't flinch. He stood silent, breathing slow, his rifle leaning just inside the door if he needed it. "Say your piece, Victor," he said, voice flat as the frozen earth. Victor's gaze flicked to the cabin again. "I'm not here for old debts," he lied, tone almost playful. "I'm here for her. Meredith Price. Or should I say, Meredith Carter. You think changing a name hides what she took from my employer." A sickening cold spread through Callum's veins. Meredith hadn't told him everything. He'd suspected as much, but hearing her past laid bare in Victor's venomous words made his blood pound. "She's not yours to find," Callum said evenly. "She's under my roof now." He stepped closer, boots sinking into the snow, eyes alight with cruel amusement. Behind him, the other two riders adjusted their coats, hands never straying far from their guns. The air was so still, it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Inside the cabin, Meredith listened to every word, heart slamming against her ribs. The children clung to her, wide-eyed, the threat of being torn from this fragile piece more terrifying than any storm. She knew Victor's words were true. She had fled with documents exposing a network of men who profited off suffering, men like Victor's employer. But she hadn't run for herself. She ran because staying would have doomed her children. Victor's voice lowered, almost conspiratorial. "Callum, we don't need to make this ugly. Step aside, give me the woman, and you can go back to your quiet life. Hell, I'll even forget the past." For a heartbeat, the world was silent. Snow drifted gently from the pines. The mountains loomed ancient and indifferent, and Callum felt the weight of every choice he'd ever made pressed down on his shoulders. He thought of Meredith's trembling voice thanking him that first night, of Ethan's stubborn determination, of Lily's shy smiles, of Hannah's sleepy giggles by the fire. He thought of what it meant to let go of the life he'd finally begun to want. "No," Callum said softly, but with unbreakable finality. His eyes locked with Victor's, dark and certain. "They stay. You leave." Victor's smile vanished. Rage flickered in his gaze like lightning. "Then you die with them," he hissed. The cabin door opened quietly behind Callum, and Meredith stepped out, her face pale but set with unshakable resolve. She stood beside Callum, her presence a silent vow. "You want me?" she called, voice trembling but fierce. "Then you'll have to go through both of us." A low, mocking laugh bubbled from Victor's lips. He raised a hand, signaling his men forward, but before they could move, a sudden chorus of footsteps cracked the snow behind them. Figures appeared along the tree line. Neighbors? travelers who'd passed Callum's cabin in winters past, men and women who owed him debts of kindness, small favors or quiet rescue. They stood, rifles and shotguns in hand, faces grim with the certainty of people who'd seen enough evil to recognize it when it came knocking. Victor's eyes darted from Callum to the growing crowd, disbelief giving way to fury. "You think these farmers can stop me?" He spat, voice rising with desperation. Callum took one step forward, eyes like flint. "They don't have to stop you," he said, voice low and unshakable. "I do." Time seemed to hold its breath once more as snowflakes fell between the two men. A standoff years in the making, a reckoning for past sins and present choices. And as the first rays of dawn broke over the ridge, it was not Victor's darkness that claimed the morning, but the quiet, determined light of a man who had found something worth fighting for, something worth dying for, if need be. Inside the cabin, the children watched from the shadows, eyes wide not with fear, but with the fierce hope that maybe, finally, they were somewhere safe enough to dream. And in that frozen dawn, Meredith realized that whatever happened next, she would never run alone again. The rising sun painted the snow in shades of rose and gold, but the clearing outside Callum's cabin was still gripped by a silence so thick it felt like the world itself dared not breathe. Victor Harlan's eyes darted from the determined set of Callum's jaw to the swelling line of neighbors who had emerged from the woods. They stood shoulder to shoulder with Callum, rifles in their hands, each face carrying its own history of hardship and quiet loyalty. Their presence transformed the lonely cabin into something unbreakable, something that told Victor he was no longer dealing with a single man, but a community bound by something fiercer than blood. Meredith felt her heart seize as she stepped forward, the snow crunching softly under her boots. She moved until she stood shoulder to shoulder with Callum, her breath clouding the cold air. Though fear clawed at her chest, she wouldn't let it rule her. She'd run for too long. Today, she would stand. She glanced at Callum, meeting his gaze, and found in those storm-gray eyes not just defiance but quiet strength. A silent promise that if this was their last day, they'd face it together. Victor sneered, voice cutting through the dawn like a blade. "You think these people mean anything? You think they'll die for a woman they hardly know?" His tone dripped with contempt, but there was a flicker of unease beneath his words. He had expected fear, submission, but all he saw was resolve. A quiet voice answered him from the back of the crowd. "They don't have to know her," said old Henry, the trapper who'd once spent a bitter winter starving before Callum found him and brought him a sack of flour and a place by his fire. His voice was cracked but carried clear across the clearing. "They just have to know you." Others spoke up too. Martha, who had been widowed the same year Callum arrived in Montana, stepped forward with a shotgun in her hands, her eyes like sharpened glass. "We remember what he's done for us," she said, nodding toward Callum. "How he helped us when no one else would. That's more family than some blood ties ever gave." The words fell like stones into the cold morning, each one adding weight to the side of the man who had once believed himself destined to die alone. Callum felt something shift deep in his chest, something warm and painful and alive. He had been prepared to fight for Meredith and her children alone, but now he understood. They weren't alone anymore. The cabin behind him wasn't just a refuge. It was the heart of a family made not by birth but by choice. Victor's expression darkened, eyes narrowing into hateful slits. He lifted a gloved hand, and the two men beside him tensed, hands drifting toward their holstered pistols. Callum's muscles coiled, ready, but before violence could break the fragile dawn, Meredith's voice rang out sharp and clear. "You think you know what power is, Victor?" she called, every syllable etched with iron. "You think it's guns and threats, Power is staying when it would be easier to run. Power is choosing to protect people you don't have to. Power is standing here, together. Her voice carried across the snow like a hymn. Callum reached for her hand, his large, rough palm enveloping her smaller, trembling one. For a moment, time seemed to still entirely, the wind itself pausing to hear the heartbeat of something true. He squeezed her hand and turned his gaze to Victor, his voice low and resonant. "We're not afraid of you anymore," he said, each word like a mountain stone. "You want her, you'll have to take her over our dead bodies." A hush fell over the clearing, thick and heavy with the scent of pine and cold earth. Victor's men shifted uneasily, glancing back toward the safety of the woods, their loyalty faltering in the face of a crowd that had found something worth fighting for. Even the horses pawed the ground nervously, sensing the strange electricity in the air. Victor's fury cracked his mask of calm, but beneath it, Meredith saw what she had always suspected, a coward's soul. His eyes darted from face to face, calculating the odds. When he found nothing but unwavering determination, his lips curled into a bitter snarl. "This isn't over," he spat. "You think you can defy me? I have connections, judges, marshals, people who will tear this place apart." Callum stepped forward, so close now that their breath mingled in the frigid morning air. "Then let them come," he growled, voice low as distant thunder. "But don't mistake our kindness for weakness. We'll stand as many times as it takes." Victor's glare shifted to Meredith one last time, a silent promise of future retribution, but the icy fire in her eyes told him what he needed to know. He had already lost. With a guttural curse, he turned on his heel, mounting his horse in one fluid motion. His men hesitated, caught in the gravity of the moment, before following their master back into the forest's shadows. As the echoes of hooves faded, the clearing fell into a silence thick with disbelief, relief, and the tremulous release of held breath. Meredith turned to Callum, eyes glassy but fierce. She squeezed his hand again, her voice trembling but strong. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted, "but I know I want to face it here." Callum looked down at her, his heart raw with something so powerful it almost hurt. "Then you stay," he said softly. "All of you. For as long as you want. This is your home." The neighbors who had come expecting a fight found themselves smiling, some wiping tears, others clapping Callum's shoulder in quiet solidarity. The children peered from the cabin door, and when Meredith called them out, they ran to her, wrapping her in desperate, joyful embraces. Ethan looked up at Callum, eyes wide and searching, and without hesitation Callum crouched, opening his arms. The boy leapt into his chest, holding tight. One by one, the others came. Lily, with her doll clasped tight, and Hannah, cheeks red from cold and relief, until Callum was surrounded, their warmth sinking deeper than the bitter chill ever could. Around them, the townsfolk slowly drifted back to their homes, but their words lingered, promises of help, of shared watch, of a community reborn. When the last neighbor disappeared into the pines, Callum and Meredith stood together at the porch, watching the forest reclaim its quiet. The sun rose fully now, washing the cabin in pale light that felt like the first true day of spring. Meredith leaned her head against Callum's shoulder. The children gathered at their feet, and for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, the air around them didn't just smell of survival, but of belonging. No court ruling, no hidden past, no vengeful man could ever break what they had chosen to build here. Together, they would face every dawn, every threat, every joy, as a family that chose each other, fiercely and forever. The last snow melted with a quiet reluctance, leaving behind rivulets that traced silver lines through the dark, rich earth around Callum's cabin. Spring arrived not as a sudden flourish but as a patient, steady breath, coaxing life from the brittle remains of winter. Trees, once skeletal, sprouted buds of tender green, and the scent of damp pine drifted through open windows, mingling with the warmth of bread baking in the kitchen. The land, like the people who now called it home, was healing. Each day, the cabin felt less like a fortress against the world, and more like the heart of something alive. Callum worked tirelessly, his broad hands mending fences and rethatching the cabin roof, while Meredith patched clothes and taught the children to read letters scrawled in the margins of old books she'd found tucked away in Callum's shelves. Evenings settled into a rhythm of quiet laughter and shared meals, each night a promise that they were building more than just a shelter. They were crafting a life. Ethan took to following Callum everywhere, his thin frame growing sturdier with every chore he learned. Callum taught him how to sand a splintered table, how to saddle a horse without spooking it, and how to read the tracks of deer and foxes etched into the muddy earth. Ethan's eyes, once shadowed by fear, now gleamed with quiet determination. He began asking questions about the land, about the stars overhead, about how a man learns to stand his ground. Each answer Callum gave was a stone laid in the foundation of the boy's sense of self. Hannah and Lily wove themselves into the pulse of the cabin, their giggles drifting through the hallways as they discovered old trunks filled with scraps of cloth and buttons, treasures they used to dress their dolls and create bright patchwork gifts for Meredith. They gathered wildflowers in the meadow, leaving little bouquets on Callum's workbench or beside the children's shared bed. These small, delicate offerings became daily reminders of the hope blossoming alongside the crocuses and violets pushing up through the thawing soil. Meredith's presence transformed the cabin in ways Callum hadn't known were possible. She opened the shutters each morning to let the dawn light spill across the floor, humming softly as she swept the hearth. She planted herbs in cracked clay pots along the windowsill, their fragrance curling through the air with every breeze. She found joy in the smallest of tasks, scrubbing linens in the creek, teaching Lily to braid her hair, reading aloud by lamplight until Hannah and Ethan fell asleep on either side of her. Her voice carried warmth that seeped into the logs of the cabin, turning old wood into something that felt like home. Yet, even in the growing peace, the scars of what they had survived lingered in quiet ways. Some nights, Meredith would wake with a strangled cry, eyes wide and unseeing as memories clawed her from sleep. Callum learned to rise without a word, pulling her into the shelter of his arms until her breathing slowed. Some mornings, Callum himself would stand on the porch before dawn, eyes scanning the tree line, a silent sentinel still wary of dangers he couldn't name. They never spoke of these moments, but the understanding between them deepened each time. It was during one of those dawn vigils that Meredith stepped outside, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She stood beside Callum, the silence stretching easy between them, and slipped her hand into his. "You don't have to keep watch alone," she said softly. He looked down, a slow smile breaking across his face as he squeezed her hand. "I know," he replied, voice husky, "but I don't mind. It reminds me what I'm protecting." As the days grew longer, the children began exploring farther afield, venturing into the woods beyond the clearing. Callum taught them how to recognize the bright red warning of poison sumac, how to find fresh water by reading the lay of the land, how to follow the lazy hum of bees to hidden hives bursting with honey. Their laughter echoed between the trees, wild and unafraid, like the forest had finally accepted them as its own. Meredith found purpose in the routines of spring. She mended what could be saved from the long, hard winter and traded pies and preserves with neighbors who came by more often now, drawn to the life that thrived at Callum's homestead. These visits were filled with stories and shy invitations, hints that the community, once skeptical of a lone man with a grim past, now saw the cabin as a beacon of resilience and belonging. One evening, after the children had been tucked in beneath blankets that smelled of soap and sunshine, Callum and Meredith sat by the crackling fire. The flames painted shifting constellations across the walls, and outside, frogs sang softly from the thawed banks of the creek. Meredith leaned her head on Callum's shoulder, breathing in the scent of pine and smoke that clung to him like an old friend. "I didn't know a place could feel like this," she whispered, voice breaking with awe. "I thought safety was something you had to steal, something temporary." Callum shifted to face her, his eyes dark and steady. "It doesn't have to be," he said, cupping her cheek with a hand rough from work but impossibly gentle. "We can build something no one can take from us, something stronger than the past." Meredith's eyes filled with tears, but they didn't fall. She pressed her lips to his, slow and certain, sealing a promise neither of them had dared voice before. When they pulled apart, the silence between them felt different, not empty, but full of everything they had found in each other. Days melted into weeks, each one carrying them deeper into a season that felt earned rather than granted. The garden behind the cabin took root under Meredith's careful tending, rows of beans, squash, and potatoes sprouting in dark, generous soil. Ethan helped her stake the taller plants, while Hannah and Lily chased butterflies between the furrows, squealing with delight. Callum repaired the old barn, his movements sure and patient, and taught Ethan how to coax stubborn hinges back to life. Evenings were filled with music now, Meredith humming lullabies from her childhood, Callum whistling low tunes he'd learned riding lonely trails years ago. The cabin walls soaked up every note, every breath, until the place itself seemed to hum with quiet joy. As spring unfurled fully across the valley, Callum found himself watching Meredith with a sense of wonder he couldn't contain. He watched her teaching Hannah to knead dough, her hands dusted with flour. He watched her laughing with Ethan as they raced across the meadow. He watched her soothing Lily to sleep after a tumble scraped her knee. Each small moment layered itself over the ache of what had been lost, building something new, something whole. One evening, as the stars kindled bright above the cabin, Callum took Meredith's hand in his. Their children nestled asleep inside. He cleared his throat, words heavy but sure. "I know you've been waiting for a reason to stay," he began quietly. Meredith's eyes widened, shining in the moonlight. "But I'm not asking you to stay anymore," he continued, voice low and fierce. "I'm asking you to make this your home, to make us your family." Meredith's breath caught, tears spilling freely at last. She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in the curve of his neck. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Callum, always." As they stood there beneath the infinite sky, the world felt vast, but no longer empty. They had not merely survived. They had laid the first stones of a life no storm could sweep away. A home, a family, a springtime born from ashes. The story of Meredith Price and Callum Ridge is not merely one of survival against impossible odds. It is the story of rebirth, of how two people shattered by betrayal, loss, and loneliness found the courage to trust again, to build a new life from the rubble of the past, and to redefine the very meaning of the family. It began in the deadliest cold, when Meredith staggered through a blizzard with 3 children and no hope, her past a burden she couldn't outrun. Abandoned by a cruel man and chased by darker forces, she had only one goal: keep her children alive. That night, she reached a cabin lit like a lantern in the dark, a place owned by a solitary man with scars deeper than the snow. Callum Ridge wasn't expecting company. He wasn't looking to be saved. But when he opened the door and let Meredith and her children inside, everything began to change. What followed wasn't easy. Mistrust, silence, and painful memories filled the small space between them. But in the quiet moments, over cups of coffee, shared chores, and the first sounds of children laughing again, a fragile sanctuary took root. Callum, who had locked himself away from the world, began to thaw. Meredith, who had forgotten what it felt like to be safe, began to believe again. The children, once terrified and hollow-eyed, rediscovered joy. Together, they created a rhythm, chopping wood, baking bread, telling stories by the fire. A family was forming, not by blood, but by choice. Then came the storm they couldn't escape. The arrival of Victor Harlan, a ghost from Meredith's past, and a man bent on reclaiming what she had stolen to expose injustice. His threats were real, his power terrifying. But Callum stood his ground, not out of obligation, but out of love. And when Meredith stood beside him, refusing to run, the world shifted. Their courage summoned more than just resolve. It summoned community. People Callum had once helped, forgotten farmers, lonely widows, travelers saved from frostbite, came to his defense, armed not only with rifles but with loyalty. What happened next was no battle. It was a revelation. Victor saw that power wasn't in fear or bullets. It was in the unwavering unity of those who chose love, even when it was dangerous. Defeated, he left, and in his wake, Meredith and Callum remained standing, closer, stronger, unbreakable. Spring came, and with it, rebirth. The cabin became a home. Meredith planted herbs and braided hair. Callum taught the children how to mend tools and read the sky. Ethan grew into a young man with steady hands and brighter eyes. Hannah and Lily filled the cabin with laughter and light. Callum and Meredith discovered the comfort of shared silence, the power of waking up beside someone who had chosen to stay. They built gardens, raised fences, and opened their doors to neighbors who once doubted them. But the true transformation wasn't in the land. It was in the people. Callum, once broken by regret, learned to believe in his worth again. Meredith, once hunted and haunted, learned to let others carry her pain. The children, once victims of abandonment, learned what it meant to be cherished. Their story is not just a love story. It is a declaration that no past is too dark, no wound too deep, and no storm too violent to keep people from building something beautiful together. It tells us that family is not defined by blood or legality, but by presence, by shared burdens, by laughter echoing in warm rooms and arms that never push you away. So, what does this mean for us today? It means we must be brave enough to open our doors, to let others in, even when it's uncomfortable. It means standing up for what's right, not just for ourselves, but for those who can't stand alone. It means recognizing that our broken pieces can still build something whole, if we have the courage to try. In a world that often feels cold and disconnected, Meredith and Callum's story reminds us that connection is possible, that healing takes time, but it is worth it, that even those who've lost everything can find a second chance, not in grand gestures, but in quiet, daily choices to love again. And that's what Wild West Legends is all about. Not just gunslingers and sheriffs, but ordinary people who became extraordinary because they chose courage, compassion, and love in the face of fear. If this story moved you, if you felt the snow, heard the fire crackle, saw yourself in Meredith's tears or Callum's guarded silence, don't let the legend end here. Subscribe to Wild West Legends. Help us keep telling these stories. Stories of people who didn't make the history books, but who shaped the frontier with grit, heart, and hope. We've got more legends to share. Saddle up, stay brave, I never stopped believing in second chances.